People in this neighborhood didn't gossip about affairs or bankruptcies anymore. They gossiped about the Cole twins, and how 9 caregivers had gone into that mansion and none of them had lasted a season. The 10th wasn't even supposed to be one of them. She was hired to mop floors, not raise children. Nobody warned her what she'd find behind that staircase. From the outside, the Cole mansion looked like proof that money solves everything. The marble, the landscaped gardens, the security gate that opened like a held breath, the heated pool nobody swam in anymore. Inside it ran on a different rule entirely. Nobody stayed. Not the agency's top-rated nanny. Not the one with a decade of experience. Not the one who came with glowing references from a senator's household. 6 years old, and Jaden and Jordan Cole had gone through more caregivers than most children go through birthdays. Their father, Oliver, could restructure a company in a boardroom in under an hour. He could not survive a Tuesday afternoon in his own house. The stories had become a kind of local legend, retold with a mix of pity and disbelief. There was the nanny who found frogs stuffed inside her suitcase the night before a flight home, and screamed loud enough that security came running. The one who woke at 3 in the morning to an alarm clock hidden inside her pillowcase, set on purpose night after night, until she stopped sleeping altogether and simply left. The one who found her car keys missing for 2 full days, only for them to turn up submerged in the fish tank, dangling from the mouth of a plastic castle. Another opened her closet one morning to find every piece of clothing she owned floating in the swimming pool, sleeves spread out on the water like they were drowning. Bedroom doors got barricaded from the inside with furniture the boys had no business being able to lift. Dinner plates got overturned, seemingly for no reason at all, mid-meal, mid-sentence, sending mashed potatoes sliding down the front of a housekeeper's uniform while Oliver sat frozen at the head of the table, fork halfway to his mouth, wondering what he had done wrong this time. Each incident got worse than the last, as though the twins were testing not just the nanny's patience but the exact point at which patience finally broke. What nobody mentioned, because nobody had thought to look closely enough, was what happened after. Whenever a nanny finally packed her bags and walked out through the gates, Jaden and Jordan didn't celebrate. They didn't laugh or high-five, or run off to plan the next round of chaos. They stood together at the top of the staircase, perfectly still, and watched her go. Oliver assumed it was satisfaction. He never once considered it might be fear. 3 years earlier, the boys had lost their mother without warning. Amelia Cole, gone in the space of a single morning, there and then simply not there, in a way 6-year-old minds could sense but not fully hold. There had been no long illness to prepare them, no gradual goodbye. One day she was reading to them at breakfast, and the next, adults in dark clothing were speaking in hushed voices throughout the house, and nobody explained anything to 2 little boys who kept asking when she was coming back. Oliver had responded to it the only way he knew how. He worked. He filled his calendar with meetings and flights and multimillion-dollar contracts, and somewhere in the process convinced himself that if his sons had the best schools, the best doctors, the best of everything money could arrange, then he had done his job as a father. He told himself grief was something you outran if you moved fast enough. Whenever a nanny complained, he raised her salary. Whenever one quit, he hired someone with a longer resume. It never once occurred to him that the problem might not be qualifications, that no amount of experience could substitute for the one thing his sons had actually lost. That morning, the 9th nanny came down the grand staircase with one suitcase half-zipped and a wet shoe, a streak of syrup across her blouse she hadn't noticed yet. She didn't stop walking until she reached the gate. "Please," Oliver said, following her into the marble foyer. "Whatever happened, we can discuss it. I'll double your salary." She turned around just long enough to answer him. "There's nothing to discuss, Mr. Cole. I wouldn't come back here for triple." Then, quieter, almost like she hadn't meant to say it out loud, "Your sons aren't trying to make people leave. I think they're trying to prove that everybody eventually does." Before Oliver could ask what she meant by that, she was gone, climbing into a taxi that disappeared through the gates. He stood alone in the driveway, a man who negotiated with bankers and politicians for a living, with absolutely no idea what to do next. It was a feeling he hadn't had since the funeral. If you believe a child's worst behavior is sometimes their only way of asking to be loved, take a second to like and subscribe, because what walked through the Cole family's gates that same afternoon had no idea it was about to change everything. Her name was Molly Quincy, and she hadn't come to fix two little boys. She'd come to clean floors. The agency had stopped sending nannies to the Cole house weeks ago. None were left willing to take the case, so instead they'd sent a temporary housemaid, and Molly had taken the job because rent doesn't wait for better circumstances to come along. She was a beautiful young black woman with natural curly hair pulled back, a calm voice, and the tired but steady eyes of someone who understood what it meant to get through hard seasons without falling apart. Oliver met her in the foyer before she'd even set her bag down. "My house manager will explain your duties. You clean. Nothing else." He glanced toward the staircase, where two small faces had already appeared behind the railing and just as quickly vanished. "And particularly, stay away from my sons." Molly nodded. She didn't argue. She had no way of knowing that the boys upstairs had already made her the same silent promise they made every new arrival the moment she walked through the door. "We'll see how long this one lasts." By the end of her first hour alone in that kitchen, she found out exactly how they intended to test it. She heard whispering from somewhere near the pantry, low and quick, and before she could turn around, an entire bag of flour came down across the floor she had just finished mopping, a white cloud settling over the tile like snow. Molly stood completely still, staring at the mess. From behind the kitchen island, two pairs of eyes watched her, waiting to see what she would do. Jaden leaned toward his brother, already certain of the answer. "Let's see how long this one lasts." Molly looked down at the flour settling over her shoes, the white cloud still drifting in the air like it hadn't decided where to land. Behind the island, she could hear the faint scrape of two small bodies trying to stay very still. She didn't shout. She didn't even sigh, not really. "Well," she said, brushing a streak of white off her sleeve, "somebody has made it snow indoors." Silence. Not even a giggle. Molly walked to the utility closet, unhurried, and came back with two smaller brooms alongside her own, the kind sized for hands much littler than hers. She set them against the counter without looking toward the island. "Snow crew needed," she announced to the empty kitchen. "Any volunteers?" Nothing moved. But she caught it, the smallest huff of a laugh, quickly swallowed, from somewhere behind the cabinets. Jordan's laugh. A second later came the unmistakable sound of a hand clamping over a mouth, and a whispered "stop it" that was unmistakably Jaden's. Molly finished sweeping alone. She didn't mention it again. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next several days the tests kept coming, each one a little more deliberate than the last. Her cleaning cloths vanished from the laundry room and turned up days later stuffed behind a sofa cushion. Her shoes disappeared from beside the back door and reappeared inside the dryer. Someone poured a full cup of juice across a floor she had mopped 20 minutes earlier, the puddle spreading in a shape too neat to be an accident. Toy cars showed up lined along the hallway exactly where a person walking at a normal pace, carrying a laundry basket, might not see them until it was too late. Toothpaste appeared smeared across the bathroom mirror in a pattern that looked almost like handwriting, if handwriting were done with fingers. And one morning Molly picked up a spray bottle to find the label peeled off and swapped with another. She caught it only because the smell was wrong and set both bottles aside without a word. She never lost her temper. She also never let any of it slide without consequence, not punishment exactly but repair. The juice got cleaned up by small hands under her supervision, even if it took 3 times as long that way. The toy cars got picked up and sorted back into their bin. Nobody got yelled at. Nobody got humiliated either. Molly seemed to understand, in a way none of the previous nannies ever had, that there was a difference between holding a child accountable and making him feel small for it. Jaden watched her reactions the way a general studies a map. He was the one planning it all, Molly could tell within the first week. Jordan followed because Jordan trusted him, the way younger siblings trust the one who seems less afraid. Then came the vase. It was an antique thing worth more than most people's cars, sitting on a pedestal in the main hallway. Nobody ever established exactly how it happened. A thrown ball, an elbow, a dare gone too far. But the crash echoed through the entire ground floor loud enough that Oliver's assistant came sprinting from the office wing already braced for a disaster. This time was different. Molly saw it the second she rounded the corner. Jaden had gone completely still, the color drained from his face. Jordan's eyes had already welled up, his whole body curled slightly inward, the posture of a child bracing for something. This wasn't the gleeful stillness of the flower incident. This was fear. Molly reached them before the assistant did. She crouched down between the two boys, glass glittering across the marble around them, and asked the only question that mattered. "Are either of you cut?" Jaden blinked at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. "No," he said, barely above a whisper. "Jordan?" He shook his head, too shaken to speak at all. Molly exhaled, and something in her shoulders loosened. "Then that's the important part." She stood and waved both of them back a step. "Stay right there. Let me get the glass first." She swept every shard herself, unhurried, while the assistant hovered uselessly nearby and the boys stood pressed against the wall, watching her the way you watch something you don't quite trust yet but can't stop looking at. It was later that afternoon, while Molly folded towels in the laundry room, that she noticed Jordan lingering in the doorway watching her. "Something wrong?" she asked without turning around. "No. You sure?" He hesitated. "Aren't you angry? About the vase?" He nodded. "Things can be replaced," Molly said simply. Jordan seemed to turn that over for a long moment, his small face serious in a way that didn't match his age. "People can't?" he asked. Molly went still, a towel half folded in her hands. "No," she said quietly. "People can't." Jordan didn't say anything else. He just stood there a moment longer before wandering off, and Molly stayed exactly where she was, feeling like something important had just cracked open between them, even if neither of them could have named it. Oliver found her not long after, standing in the hallway examining the empty pedestal. "I told you not to interfere," he said, his voice clipped. "I was making sure they weren't hurt," Molly answered evenly. "They know exactly what they're doing." His jaw was tight. "This isn't the first vase in this house that's ended up broken." "Maybe," Molly said. She didn't argue further than that. Oliver held her gaze a second longer, like he was waiting for her to say something else, or perhaps hoping she wouldn't. Then he turned and walked back toward his study without another word. Molly watched him go, aware, for the first time since she'd arrived, that keeping this job might mean more than surviving the twins. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Molly passed the twins' bedroom on her way to return a stack of folded towels. The door was cracked open. She slowed without meaning to when she heard Jordan's voice, small and uncertain in the dark. "Do you think she'll be here tomorrow?" Pause. Then Jaden, flat and certain, like a fact he'd learned a long time ago and stopped questioning. "No. They always leave." Molly stood frozen in the hallway, the towels still warm in her arms, and for the first time since walking through the coal gates, she understood that she wasn't looking at two difficult children at all. By the end of her second week, Molly had stopped reacting to the twins and started watching them instead. It began almost by accident. After the vase shattered in the hallway, after she asked if they were hurt before she asked what happened, she noticed something she hadn't expected. Jaden and Jordan hadn't run. They'd frozen, waiting for the yelling that always came next, and when it didn't come, they seemed almost confused by the silence. That confusion told her more than the flower, the frogs, or the ruined furniture ever had. She started paying attention to timing instead of behavior. The mischief never happened randomly. It escalated in waves, always heaviest in the days right before a nanny's patience finally broke, as if the boys could sense the exact moment someone was about to give up, and raced to get there first. And once a departure became certain, once suitcases came out and taxis got called, something strange happened. The chaos stopped. The boys went quiet. They stood at the top of the staircase and watched, calm as anything, like the worst had already happened and there was nothing left to brace for. Molly thought about that for a long time, standing in the laundry room one evening, a stack of towels in her arms. They weren't trying to make people leave. They were making sure leaving happened on their terms instead of catching them by surprise. She didn't confront them with it. 6-year-olds don't respond well to being diagnosed, and besides, she wasn't sure she was even right. So instead of saying anything, she did something simpler. She became predictable. Breakfast came at the same time every morning, no matter what. The after-school snack was always waiting on the same plate in the same spot on the counter. Her greeting at the door never changed. The same "there you are" tone, the same crouch to their eye level, every single day, whether they'd been perfect angels or hidden her shoes in the pool filter. Jaden tested it first, the way he tested everything. "When are you leaving?" he asked one afternoon, not looking up from the puzzle he was pretending to care about. 5 o'clock, Molly said. "Same as always." "No." He finally looked at her. "I mean leaving. Molly understood exactly what he was asking. She sat down across from him instead of answering right away. "When my job here ends, I'll tell you," she said. "I'm not going to disappear on you without saying goodbye." Jaden shrugged like it didn't matter and went back to the puzzle. But he didn't argue and he didn't test her again that day. Molly noticed. She had a feeling he remembered every word of it, even if he'd rather eat glass than admit it. She started folding the twins into her work instead of doing it around them. Jordan, it turned out, loved sorting laundry by color. He took the job with a seriousness that made Molly bite back a smile, announcing each item like he was calling out evidence in a trial. Jaden couldn't resist the challenge, so bed-making became a race, sheets flying, Molly always managing to lose by exactly 1 second in a way that made him puff up with pride. Pancake batter got stirred by small hands more often than not, flour dusted across the counter instead of the floor for once. She invented competitions out of nothing. Who could carry the most towels without dropping one? Who could name the most vegetables before the timer ran out? She listened when they wanted to talk, and she let the silence sit when they didn't, without ever pushing. Slowly, in pieces too small to name all at once, their laughter started coming back. Oliver noticed before he understood what he was noticing. He stepped into the dining room one evening, expecting the usual, an empty table, a tense standoff, plates that had barely been touched. Instead, he stopped in the doorway. Both boys were sitting at the table. No shouting. No overturned dishes. Jordan was actually eating, fork in hand, working through a plate of pasta like it was nothing unusual at all. "You burned that one," Jaden announced, pointing at a slightly overdone piece of garlic bread on Molly's plate. "Then Chef Jaden is welcome to take over the kitchen anytime he'd like," Molly said without missing a beat. Jordan laughed. A real laugh, loud and unguarded, the kind that made his shoulders shake. Oliver stood frozen in the doorway. He hadn't heard that sound in months. He couldn't immediately place how long it had actually been, and that unsettled him more than the silence ever had. He should have felt relief. Instead, watching Molly lean over to wipe a smear of sauce off Jordan's chin, watching Jaden fight a smile he clearly didn't want anyone to see, Oliver felt something closer to dread. It wasn't that he disliked her. That wasn't it at all. It was that he recognized what he was looking at. Attachment. The kind that took root slowly and then all at once, the kind his sons hadn't shown anyone in 3 years. And attachment, in Oliver's experience, was simply the shape loss took before it arrived. Every person his sons let themselves love was one more person who could eventually be gone. He knew that math better than anyone in this house. He didn't say anything. He turned and walked back toward his study, telling himself he had calls to make. It was a few afternoons later that Molly went looking for Jaden and couldn't find him anywhere. She checked the library first, then the garden, then the game room where he sometimes hid to avoid piano practice. Nothing. The house had that particular stillness that meant a child was somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. Then she noticed a door at the end of the west hallway standing slightly open. A door Oliver had specifically instructed the staff to leave closed. Always, no exceptions. Amelia Cole's dressing room. Molly hesitated only a second before pushing it open the rest of the way. Jaden was sitting cross-legged on the floor in the middle of the room, a framed photograph clutched in both hands. Scattered around him were things that had no business being there. A scarf, a jewelry box, a hairbrush still holding strands of dark curly hair, items that had quietly vanished from around the house over the past several months, one by one, and that no one had ever managed to find. Jaden's head snapped up the moment the door creaked wider. "You can't be here." His voice came out sharper than he probably meant it to, the photograph pulled instantly against his chest like something he needed to protect. "Neither can you apparently," Molly said gently, staying in the doorway rather than stepping further in. His eyes narrowed, testing her. Are you going to tell Dad? Molly let the question sit for a moment before answering. Not unless you want me to. That seemed to loosen something in his shoulders just slightly. Molly's gaze moved slowly around the room, not to inspect, but to understand. A silk scarf draped over the arm of a chair. A perfume bottle, half empty, capped carefully like something meant to last. A stack of photographs fanned across the vanity. A jewelry box sitting open, its contents undisturbed. A handwritten birthday card propped against a mirror, the ink faded but legible. And folded in Jaden's lap, beneath the photograph, the sleeve of an old sweater. She understood then. This wasn't mischief. This was a boy who had been quietly rescuing pieces of his mother, one at a time, before they could disappear the way she had, sneaking in when the house was empty, tucking small things into his pockets, hiding them somewhere he thought no one would ever look. Not stealing. Salvaging. Molly lowered herself to the floor a few feet away from him, not close enough to crowd him, close enough to matter. For a long moment neither of them said anything. Then Jaden spoke so quietly she almost missed it. Sometimes I try to remember what her voice sounded like. He was staring at the photograph, not at her. And I can't. Not really. I remember pictures. I don't remember the sound. His hands tightened slightly around the frame. What if one day I can't remember her face either? What if I only remember pictures of pictures? Molly didn't tell him it would be okay. She didn't tell him time healed everything, or that he was too young to worry about things like this. She simply said, missing someone is what happens when love doesn't have anywhere to go. It doesn't mean you're losing her. It means you loved her enough that the missing had to go somewhere. Jaden turned that over in silence, his jaw working like he was trying to decide whether to believe it. Then, so quietly it barely reached her, he asked the question that had clearly been sitting underneath everything else. If I like you, if I let myself like you, does that mean I'm forgetting her? Molly felt the weight of that land somewhere behind her ribs. She made sure he was looking at her before she answered. I could never be your mother, Jaden. Not ever. That's not what I'm here to be. His eyes were already filling, glassy in the low light. But I can still care about you. Both things can be true. Caring about me doesn't erase her. It's not a trade. He didn't say anything back. He just leaned sideways, slowly, until his shoulder pressed against her arm, and then all at once he was against her, face buried into her side, his small body shaking with something he'd clearly been holding in for a long time. It was the first time he had ever reached for her on his own. Molly wrapped an arm around him and let him stay there as long as he needed. Jordan's unraveling looked different. It happened after dark, in the hallway outside his room, where Molly began finding him nearly every night, barefoot, wide awake, wandering in slow circles like he was looking for something he couldn't name. The previous nannies had all written it down the same way: defiant, refuses bedtime, disobedient. Molly had read the notes in his file and known almost immediately they were wrong. One night she crouched down in front of him in the dim hallway light. Can't sleep again? Jordan shook his head, eyes down. Want to tell me why? It took him a while. Finally, barely above a whisper, Mommy used to sing when the room got dark. When it got scary. That was all. That was the entire explanation. 3 years of bedtime battles distilled into one sentence no one had ever asked him to say out loud. Molly walked him back to his bed and sat on the edge of it, not making a production of it, not asking any more questions. She hummed, low and simple, nothing dramatic, no song with words attached, just a quiet tune that filled the space a lullaby used to fill. Jordan's breathing slowed. His eyes grew heavy. Within minutes he was asleep. She was easing his door shut when she found Oliver standing in the hallway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the dark. You're crossing boundaries, he said, low enough not to wake anyone, but sharp all the same. He couldn't sleep, Molly said simply. He has a routine. The nanny handles bedtime. He doesn't have a nanny. The words hung there between them. Oliver's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond right away. Something about the sentence had landed somewhere he hadn't expected, and for a moment he looked less like a man laying down a rule and more like a man realizing how long it had been true, how many bedtimes he had missed without ever noticing they'd stopped being his to miss. Molly held her tongue, aware she'd already said more than she'd intended. Oliver turned and walked away without another word, and she let him go. Later that night, unable to settle, Oliver found himself standing in Jordan's doorway, unsure exactly what had drawn him there. His son was asleep, one arm flung over the blanket, his face finally at peace in a way Oliver hadn't seen in longer than he cared to admit. On the bedside table sat a piece of paper Oliver hadn't noticed before, a child's drawing, crayon pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the page. 4 figures stood in a row. Jaden. Jordan. A woman with wings drawn carefully above her shoulders. And beside her, holding hands with both boys, a 4th figure with curly hair. Oliver stood in the doorway a long time, looking at it far longer than he meant to, unable to decide whether what he felt was comfort or something closer to grief. The house didn't change overnight. It changed the way seasons change, so slowly that you only noticed by comparing what used to be there to what wasn't anymore. There used to be doors slamming at odd hours, sharp enough to rattle the pictures in the hallway. There used to be a dining table so cold and silent that even the staff serving dinner spoke in whispers, moving carefully as if any sudden sound might set something off. The boys had eaten separately for months before Molly arrived. Jaden in his room, Jordan wherever he could find a corner, because sitting together had only ever meant more chances for something to go wrong. Now there was flour dusted across small noses during Saturday baking sessions. There were races through the garden that ended in breathless collapsing onto the grass. There were dinners where all 3 of them sat at the same table without anyone bracing for disaster. And every afternoon at exactly 3:15, 2 boys stood at the front window watching for Molly's return from the market or the pharmacy or wherever her errands had taken her, as though she were the only reliable thing in a house that had forgotten how to be predictable. Oliver noticed all of it. He simply didn't know what to do with what he was noticing. He found her one evening in the kitchen, drying the last of the dishes, and the question came out before he'd fully decided to ask it. "What did you do?" Molly glanced up. "With what?" "My sons." He said it like an accusation, though it wasn't quite one. 9 professionals. Certifications, references, years of experience between them. All of them failed. "What exactly did you do?" Molly set the towel down slowly. "I didn't fix them, Mr. Cole. They were never broken. They terrorized every person who tried to care for them. Maybe," she said, choosing her words carefully, "they weren't looking for somebody qualified to control them. Maybe they were looking for somebody who wasn't afraid of their pain." Oliver went quiet. It wasn't the answer he'd expected, and it landed somewhere he clearly hadn't braced for. Molly, seeing the door was open, stepped a little further through it. "They ask about you," she said. "I see them every morning. They don't ask when they see you. They ask when you're coming home." Oliver's jaw tightened. "I built everything around them. This house, their school, their entire life." "You built everything for them," Molly said gently. Pause. "That's not always the same as building something with them." He didn't answer that. He set his glass down harder than necessary and walked out of the kitchen, and Molly let him go, aware she'd said more than her position technically allowed and unable to bring herself to regret it. What Molly didn't fully understand yet, what only Oliver carried alone in rooms no one else entered, was how completely Amelia's death had hollowed him out. He couldn't sit in her chair at the head of the dining table. It had been quietly moved to storage within a month of the funeral. He couldn't watch old home videos, the ones where her laugh filled a room he now walked through in silence. He deleted the app that used to surface old photo memories on his phone, unable to stand being ambushed by her face on an ordinary Tuesday. Worst of all, he couldn't answer his son's questions. "When is Mommy coming back? Why did she leave? Is it because of something we did?" Because he had never found language soft enough to hold both truth and mercy at once. So he had done the only thing that had ever made him feel competent. He worked. Deals closed. Buildings rose. And underneath all of it, a man quietly came apart in a way no boardroom would ever see. The twins had learned to create chaos to control their goodbyes. Oliver had learned something else entirely. He simply disappeared before anyone could leave him first. Different symptoms. Same wound. It was after that conversation in the kitchen that something in him started, tentatively, to shift. He began coming home earlier, Not dramatically, not every night, but often enough that Molly noticed and often enough that the boys noticed too, even if none of them said so out loud. The awkwardness was almost painful to watch. Oliver would sit at dinner turning his fork over in his hand, visibly searching for something to say to two children he had provided everything for and knew almost nothing about. Molly made it easier without making it obvious. "What happened at school today, Jordan?" she'd ask, casual as anything, and Jordan would launch into some elaborate story about the class hamster or a disagreement over recess rules, and Oliver would find himself actually listening, actually laughing once, caught off guard by the sound of his own laughter at his own dinner table. Then one evening, without any prompting from Molly at all, Jaden looked across the table and said, "Dad, we made volcanoes in science." Mine erupted first. It was such a small thing. An ordinary sentence any child might say to any father on any evening. But Oliver sat there for a moment like he'd been handed something fragile, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing until it was suddenly, briefly, back in his hands. "Did it?" he managed. "Tell me everything." Jaden did. Molly watched quietly from across the table and said nothing, letting the moment belong entirely to the two of them. Weeks later, Oliver's flight to the Singapore offices was cancelled without warning, some mechanical delay that would push the meetings to the following week. He found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, arriving home hours earlier than expected on an ordinary weeknight, with absolutely nowhere he had to be. The mansion was strangely quiet when he stepped through the door. He called out. No answer. The staff he passed in the hallway only shrugged. Molly and the boys had been upstairs for a while, nobody seemed to know exactly where. He climbed the staircase, his footsteps unusually loud in the silence, and it was somewhere near the top that he heard it. A voice, soft and unhurried, drifting from down the hall. "Molly." Reading aloud. Oliver followed the sound without quite deciding to, past the closed doors of rooms he rarely entered, until he reached the doorway of the master bedroom. He stopped there completely still, one hand still resting against the frame, and looked inside. The scene stopped him in the doorway like a hand pressed flat against his chest. Molly had fallen asleep sitting up against a mountain of pillows, an open storybook resting near her hand where it had slipped from her fingers mid-sentence. Her curly hair spilled loose against the white pillowcase. Jaden lay curled on her left, small and still. Jordan lay on her right, his breathing slow and even. Both boys wore matching light blue pajamas, and both of their faces held an expression Oliver hadn't seen on either of them in 3 years. The particular, unguarded piece of children who feel, without having to think about it, entirely safe. Oliver stood frozen in the doorway, still in the gray sweatshirt and jeans he'd changed into the moment he got home, no tie, no suit jacket, nothing of Mr. Cole left on him at all. Just a father standing in a doorway, looking at something he hadn't realized he'd been starving for. This was what the house used to feel like. Not this exact scene. Not this exact woman. But the feeling underneath it, the warmth, the stillness, the sense that nothing in the world needed fixing right this second. He recognized it immediately in his body before his mind had caught up, because he had lived inside that feeling once and had spent 3 years forgetting it existed. Then he saw it. Propped on the nightstand beside Jaden, half hidden behind a lamp, was the framed photograph of Amelia that had disappeared from her dressing room weeks earlier. Jaden must have brought it in here at some point, wanting her close even in sleep. Oliver's throat tightened without warning. His eyes filled before he had any chance to stop them. And then, unbidden, a memory surfaced. One he hadn't visited in years, one he'd have sworn he'd lost entirely. A night when the twins were barely 2. Amelia asleep in this same bed, a toddler tucked against each side of her, her dark curls fanned across the pillow almost exactly the way Molly's were now. Oliver had stood in nearly this same doorway, phone raised, and taken a photograph he'd meant to look at again and had somehow never found. Buried in a camera roll, he stopped scrolling through the year she died. He hadn't remembered that night in years. He hadn't let himself. Standing there now, watching a different woman hold his sons the way his wife once had, Oliver understood something with a clarity that surprised him. This wasn't Molly replacing Amelia. Nothing about this scene suggested that, and some clear-eyed part of him recognized the difference immediately. What Molly had built, without ever meaning to, was something else entirely, A place in this house where his sons were finally allowed to miss their mother instead of being quietly taught to bury it. 9 trained professionals had tried to manage his son's behavior. None of them had understood that behavior was never the actual problem. Oliver backed out of the doorway quietly before any of them woke, and stood alone in the hallway for a long time. The next morning, something in him had shifted. He attempted breakfast, badly, burning the eggs and setting off the smoke detector, which sent Jordan running downstairs in a panic that turned quickly into delighted laughter at the sight of his father standing helplessly over a smoking pan with a spatula, waving a dish towel at the alarm like it had personally offended him. Oliver cleared his afternoon and showed up, unannounced, to Jordan's school reading event, folding himself awkwardly into a chair sized for a 6-year-old while the other parents glanced over in visible surprise. The reclusive Oliver Cole, in jeans, sitting cross-legged on a classroom rug. That evening he canceled a dinner meeting he'd have never canceled a month earlier, the kind of meeting he used to consider untouchable, and told his assistant simply that something more important had come up. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. And when he found Jaden sitting on the floor outside Amelia's dressing room later that week, clearly expecting to be scolded, Oliver didn't raise his voice at all. "You can keep some of her things," he said instead, crouching down beside his son. "In your room if you want. You don't have to hide them anymore." Jaden stared at him like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Oliver went into the room with him that afternoon, the first time he'd crossed that threshold in 3 years, and together they chose a few pieces to bring out into the light. For a while it seemed like the healing might simply continue in a straight line from there. Then the anniversary arrived. Molly noticed the shift before Oliver did. Jaden grew quieter over the following days, pulling back into himself in ways she recognized from their earliest weeks together. Shorter answers, a distance in his eyes, a reluctance to be touched that hadn't been there in weeks. Jordan started waking at night again, the nightmares returning after weeks of peaceful sleep, and twice she found him standing outside his brother's door instead of hers, as though even his fear had rearranged itself around this particular week. Oliver, still learning to read his own sons, assumed it was simply a rough patch, a cold coming on, a hard week at school, nothing that wouldn't pass on its own. Molly knew better. She'd seen enough grief up close in her own life to understand it never moved in a straight line, no matter how much progress had come before it, and no matter how much anyone wanted it to. At dinner that evening, Molly's eyes fell on the small photograph of Amelia that now sat on the side table, and without thinking too hard about it, she mentioned something soft and warm, a memory pulled gently from something Oliver had once said, about a song Amelia used to hum while cooking. Jaden's hands slammed flat against the table. The room went silent instantly. Jordan froze mid-bite. Oliver's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Jaden's eyes had filled, his whole body rigid, and when he spoke his voice cracked with something too big for a 6-year-old to carry alone. "Stop talking about her." Nobody moved. Then his eyes locked directly onto Molly's, wounded and furious all at once. "You're not our mother." Jaden was already gone before anyone could stop him, chair scraping backward hard enough to nearly tip, feet pounding up the staircase 2 at a time until a door slammed somewhere above them with enough force to rattle the chandelier over the table. Jordan burst into tears almost immediately, his small shoulders shaking, his fork abandoned on his plate, and for a moment nobody at the table moved. The silence that followed felt worse than the shout had. Oliver's first instinct, sharp and automatic, was to look at Molly. Really look at her, the way you look at someone when you're bracing for goodbye. Some old, tired part of him was already certain this was it. The moment she finally decided the Cole household wasn't worth the trouble, the moment she packed a bag the way 8 nannies before her had, the moment the fragile new normal they'd built collapsed as quickly as it had come. Molly's eyes were glassy, the words clearly having landed somewhere tender. But there was no hesitation in her at all. She set her napkin down and stood. "I'll go," she said quietly, and it wasn't a question. She found Jaden's door locked, the way she'd half expected. She didn't knock hard. She didn't demand anything. She simply lowered herself to the floor outside it, back against the wall, and sat. "I know I'm not your mother," she said through the door, her voice even and unhurried. "I never once thought I was." Silence on the other side. And I'm never going to ask you to pretend that I am. Not now. Not ever. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, slowly she heard the lock click. The door opened just enough for Jaden to appear in the gap, his face wrecked, tear tracks down both cheeks, his whole body trembling with something that had clearly been building for weeks longer than this one dinner. I don't want to forget her, he choked out. Then don't, Molly said simply. You don't have to. He sank down across from her in the doorway, knees pulled to his chest. I can barely remember how she smelled anymore. I used to know exactly. Now I have to guess. His voice cracked further. And when I laugh with you, when I'm happy, I feel like I'm saying she doesn't matter as much anymore. Like being happy is the same as forgetting her. Molly felt that land somewhere deep in her chest. She waited until she was sure her voice would hold steady. Loving someone who's here doesn't mean loving someone who's gone any less, she said. Your heart isn't a cup that only holds so much, Jaden. It doesn't work that way. You can miss her with everything you have and still laugh at dinner. Both things live in you at the same time. That's not betrayal. That's just what it means to keep loving somebody who's gone. Jaden didn't answer right away. He just cried, quietly now instead of the earlier explosion, and Molly let him. Farther down the hallway, Oliver stood frozen, having followed at a distance, close enough to hear every word. He realized, standing there, exactly what he had done without ever meaning to. By refusing to say Amelia's name at dinner, by moving her chair to storage, by deleting the photo app rather than face her face on an ordinary Tuesday, he had taught his sons that grief was something shameful, something to be hidden the way he hid his own. He had built a house where missing their mother felt like a secret they had to keep, tucked away in a locked room down the hall, the same way Jaden had tucked away her scarves. No wonder Jaden had exploded. No wonder Jordan couldn't sleep. Oliver had modeled the exact silence he now watched breaking his oldest son apart, and it had taken hearing it from the other side of a locked door to finally see it clearly. He walked forward and knelt down in the hallway beside them both. Jaden flinched, bracing for the lecture he expected. Pull yourself together, apologize to Molly, we don't yell at the table. Instead Oliver said, I don't want to forget her either. Jaden looked up at him, startled. I think about her every single day, Oliver went on, his own voice unsteady now, something in it giving way after 3 years of holding perfectly still. I just never let you see it. I thought if I stayed strong, if I kept everything running, that would be enough. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Jordan appeared in the hallway then, drawn by the sound of his father's voice, and without a word he folded himself into the small space between them. Oliver pulled both boys against him, and for the first time since the funeral, he let himself cry in front of his sons. No excusing himself to his study, no closed door, nothing hidden. Later that night, once the tears had run their course, Oliver did something none of them expected. He disappeared into his study and came back with an armful of photo albums and an old laptop, the one with the videos he hadn't opened in 3 years. They sat together on the living room floor, the boys in their pajamas, Oliver still in the shirt he'd worn to dinner with the top button undone, and one by one they watched their mother move and laugh on the screen. Amelia at the beach with sand in her hair, Amelia blowing out candles on some long-ago birthday cake, Amelia mid-laugh at a joke none of them could remember the punchline to anymore. Jordan asked to replay one clip 3 times in a row, delighted every single time by the sound of her voice, as though he were memorizing it on purpose before it could slip away again. Jaden laughed and cried at once, unable to separate the two anymore, and for once he didn't seem to want to. Molly stood quietly in the doorway watching, and after a while she began to step back, wanting to leave the moment fully to the 3 of them. Molly, stay, Jordan called out, not even turning around. She stopped. Oliver looked up at her from the floor, and after a beat, he nodded. She sat down with them, and the 4 of them stayed there long past bedtime, surrounded by photographs of a woman none of them would ever stop loving. It was well past midnight, after the boys had finally fallen asleep upstairs, that Oliver sat alone in his study with a piece of paper he'd been avoiding for days. Molly's temporary contract ended in 2 weeks. Nobody in that house had said a single word about what happened after. The email from the agency arrived on a Tuesday morning, brief and businesslike, the kind of message that could end something enormous in 3 short lines. Molly's temporary placement at the Cole residence would conclude in 2 weeks, per the original terms of her contract. A new assignment was already being arranged for her, pending confirmation, somewhere across town in a household she'd never set foot in. She read it twice standing in the laundry room, a basket of small folded shirts balanced on her hip, and felt something drop through her chest, quiet and heavy, the way bad news always seemed to land in this house. She didn't know what Oliver wanted. He hadn't said a word about what came after, not since the night with the photo albums, not in all the ordinary days since, the mornings of burnt breakfast and the evenings he now made a point of coming home for. She had no claim on this family beyond a job title that had never quite fit her anyway, and she refused to let herself assume she belonged somewhere just because it had started to feel that way. Assuming things like that was how people got hurt. She'd learned that a long time before she ever walked through the Cole gates, and she wasn't about to unlearn it based on a few good weeks. Oliver was struggling with the same question in his own way, alone in his study with the same email forwarded from the agency. His first instinct, old and automatic, was money. He could offer her double what any housekeeper in the city made. Triple. He could make the number so large that leaving would be unthinkable. He sat with that idea for a while before recognizing it for what it was. Money had always been his answer, to grief, to guilt, to every problem he didn't know how to hold with his bare hands. He had raised his son's salaries for 8 different nannies and lost every single one of them anyway. Whatever this situation needed, it wasn't a bigger number. It was something he'd never been especially good at offering anyone. He was still turning it over when Jayden found Molly folding a few of her own things into a bag in the small room off the kitchen where she stayed. Jayden stopped dead in the doorway. Something in his face closed instantly, a shutter coming down behind his eyes that Molly recognized immediately, because she'd seen it on his very first day. "Are you leaving?" Jordan's voice came from behind his brother, already edged with panic, his small hand gripping the back of Jayden's shirt. Molly set down the sweater she was folding and turned to face them fully. She had promised him once that she wouldn't disappear without saying goodbye, and she wasn't about to break that now, even if the truth was hard. "My temporary job here is almost finished," she said gently. "That's true. I won't lie to you about that." Jayden's jaw tightened. "I knew it," he said, flat and quiet, all the warmth gone out of his voice in an instant. "I knew it wouldn't last." He turned and walked away before she could say anything else. No shouting, no slammed door, nothing broken on his way out. Just distance, deliberate and complete. Molly watched him go and felt the difference immediately. The old Jayden would have sabotaged her on his way out the door. Hidden her keys, poured something across the floor, forced a goodbye on his own terms the way he'd done to every caregiver before her. This Jayden simply withdrew, quiet and controlled, and somehow that was worse to watch because it meant the wound was real again, not performance. It also meant, she realized, that some part of him had actually let himself trust her enough to be hurt by this. She followed him partway down the hall but didn't push further than the doorway of his room. Some things couldn't be fixed by chasing. That evening, Oliver did something he hadn't done in 3 years of solving problems on his family's behalf without ever consulting them. He sat both boys down and talked to them directly. "I got the same email Molly did," he said. "About her job here ending." Jordan's face crumpled instantly. "Can't you just pay her? You have enough money. Pay her to stay forever." Oliver looked at his younger son for a long moment, hearing his own worldview reflected back at him in a 6-year-old's voice, and understanding all at once how thoroughly he had taught them that every problem had a price tag if you looked hard enough. "Molly isn't something we buy, Jordan," he said quietly. "That's not how this works. Not with people who actually matter." He found her later that night in the kitchen, drying the same stack of dishes she always seemed to be drying when difficult conversations found her. "When you first came here," Oliver said, "I told you not to interfere with my sons." Molly's mouth curved, faint and tired. "I remember. I was wrong." She waited. "I'd like to offer you a permanent position in this house," he said. "Not maid. Not nanny exactly either, something more than either title covers. Someone trusted to help run this household and raise these boys alongside me, for as long as you're willing to stay." He paused, and when he continued, His voice had lost its usual careful control. I'm not asking because they behave better when you're here, though they do. I'm asking because this house became a home again the moment you stopped being afraid to actually care about us. All of us. Including me, I think, though I wasn't ready to say that part out loud until just now. Molly didn't answer right away. She stood there with a dish towel still in her hands, searching his face for something, and whatever she found there, she wasn't ready to name yet either. Later that night, rain moving in steady sheets against the windows, Oliver walked quietly past the twins' bedroom on his way to bed. The door was open just a crack. He heard Jaden's voice first, small and uncertain in the dark. Do you think Molly's still going to leave? Oliver stopped outside the door, his hand hovering near the frame, and waited to hear what his son believed. Inside the bedroom, Jaden's voice broke the quiet again. Jordan? Yeah. Do you think Molly's going to leave? There was a pause, longer this time, the kind of pause that meant Jordan was actually thinking it through instead of just answering out of hope. No, he said finally. How do you know? Jordan's answer came without hesitation, certain in a way only a 6-year-old fully believing something could sound. Because Molly doesn't run when we're bad. Jaden went quiet at that. Outside the door, so did Oliver, one hand pressed against the wall as if he needed it to stay standing. Then Jordan finished the thought. She stays until we're good again. Oliver brought a hand up over his mouth, his eyes burning, his breath catching somewhere in his chest. He stood there in the dark hallway a long time, letting 8 words from a 6-year-old rearrange something in him that 3 years of grief counselors and quiet nights alone in his study had never managed to touch. That was it. That was the impossible thing none of the trained professionals had ever understood. Not obedience. Not manners. Not a house free of broken vases and hidden shoes. His sons had needed proof, small, repeated, unglamorous proof, that someone could witness their worst moments and choose to remain anyway. 9 nannies had tried to survive Jaden and Jordan Cole. Molly had simply refused to leave them. The next morning, Molly found Oliver in the kitchen before either of the boys were awake. I'll stay, she said without preamble, the words she'd clearly been rehearsing since the night before. Something in Oliver's shoulders loosened for the first time in what felt like years. But I need something in return, Molly continued. You have to stay too. Oliver frowned, not quite following. I'm not going anywhere. You know what I mean. Her voice was gentle, but it didn't back down. They don't need me instead of you, Oliver. They need you. I can be here every day, but I can't be the only steady thing in this house forever. That's not fair to them, and it's not fair to you either. Oliver was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. Then he nodded, slowly, like a man agreeing to something harder than any deal he'd ever closed in a boardroom. I'm not going to disappear into work again, he said. I can't promise I'll get every evening right. But I'm not going back to who I was before you got here. He kept that promise, imperfectly, the way promises actually get kept. Months passed. Oliver began blocking off Thursday and Sunday evenings on his calendar as untouchable, no exceptions, a rule his assistant eventually stopped even trying to push against. The twins still misbehaved sometimes. They were 6, not saints, and there were still spilled juice and muddy footprints and the occasional shouting match over whose turn it was to pick the movie. Molly still made them clean up their own messes, patient but unmoved, because consistency had never stopped mattering just because the fear underneath it had eased. Jordan slept through most nights now without wandering the hallway, though on the hardest nights Molly still sat beside him and hummed until his breathing slowed. Jaden kept one of his mother's scarves in a small wooden memory box on his dresser, in plain sight, no longer something to hide behind lamps or bury in dressing rooms. Amelia's photographs had made their way back onto the walls, into hallways, onto side tables, no longer forbidden territory. Oliver spoke her name at dinner now without flinching. The mansion, once famous only for the sound of doors slamming, now regularly filled with something the neighbors had stopped expecting to hear from that house at all. Laughter. One Sunday afternoon that spring, the 4 of them stood together in the garden with 3 young flowering shrubs and a wheelbarrow of soil. Why 3? Jaden asked, wiping dirt from his hands onto his jeans. Molly knelt beside the first hole, pressing the roots gently into the earth. 1 for remembering, she said. Jordan patted soil around the second. One for growing. Oliver looked between his sons, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth as he lifted the third shrub into place. And the third. Molly glanced up at him, something warm and unguarded in her expression. For whatever comes next. Nobody explained further. Nobody needed to. That evening, after bath time and stories and the long familiar ritual of getting two 6-year-olds into bed, Oliver walked down the hallway toward his own room and found himself slowing near the boy's door, the way he had that very first night months ago. The scene was almost exactly the same. Molly asleep against the pillows. Jaden curled on one side, Jordan on the other. An open storybook resting where it had slipped from her hand. But this time, Oliver didn't freeze in the doorway. He didn't stand there shocked, unable to move, mourning something he didn't yet have words for. He walked in. He lifted the book gently from Molly's loose fingers and set it on the nightstand. He pulled the blanket up higher over both boys' shoulders. He reached over and clicked off the small lamp, leaving only the soft glow from the hallway. He was almost to the door when Jordan's sleepy voice reached him. "Dad." Oliver turned back. "You're still here?" Something shifted across Oliver's face, 3 years of distance folding quietly into something steadier, something that had finally learned how to stay. He walked back to the bed and crouched down beside it. "I'm still here," he said. Jordan's eyes were already closing again. "Good," he murmured, and within seconds he was asleep. Oliver stood in the doorway a while longer before finally switching off the hall light behind him. No nanny could handle Oliver Cole's twins, because handling had never been the real problem. Jaden and Jordan hadn't needed another adult capable of surviving their tantrums. They had needed adults capable of seeing what those tantrums were hiding. Molly Quincy hadn't performed the impossible by turning 2 grieving boys into perfectly behaved children. She had done something far harder and far more lasting. She had taught 2 frightened brothers that affection didn't always end in goodbye. She had taught a millionaire father that providing a beautiful life was never the same thing as being present inside it. And somewhere along the way, without ever meaning to, she had turned a mansion full of expensive, replaceable things into the one thing money had never been able to buy. A home where love was finally allowed to stay.